Thank you for tuning into our podcast. We are coming to you from South Hadley, Massachusetts. I am your host, Carrie, and I am here with our very own historian, Robert Coleman. He is the founder and also the tour guide of the historical tours of Greater Holyoke. Now, today we'll be discussing Brightside. So tell us about the Mount St. Vincent Orphanage.
Yes, the Mount St. Vincent Orphanage of Holyoke is the girls' orphanage, and that one was created first. When the Sisters of Providence came from Ontario to Holyoke, Massachusetts, 150 years ago, so 1873, they created Providence Hospital, but also, maybe a decade later, they created a girls' orphanage, and this was out in the Ingleside neighborhood of Holyoke, the far southern part. And there was very little out there, and that was good because you wanted the orphans away from the downtown area, from family life, which was not good. And so they had a house out there, and they called it Mount St. Vincent. In the first orphanage for girls, they had also some of the elderly men because they had nowhere else to put them. And it was also a convent, so the nuns that worked out there also lived in that place. So this is the start of a Catholic orphanage in western Massachusetts. And it grew and grew from there and led on to many things, including a boys' orphanage, and they also had a women's elderly home. That was in the downtown area. And the whole area grew from there to the need for more and more. For instance, if you have this many people out there, maybe you need mass service on Sundays. And sure, they could use the house at the beginning, but that grew so that they started their own chapel. And for 3 years, that chapel became a regular church, which was consecrated or holy to be a church. And so you have all these needs push for greater and greater services. And what would happen next was...
Tell us about the Brightside Orphanage.
Right, so you had the girls all set up in the Mount St. Vincent Orphanage. And the boys, well, in the beginning, what they did, they kept them downtown. And they stayed mostly at a building that was called the St. Jerome's Institute. It was really a boys' Catholic school on the ground floor, but at night, any boy that was orphaned would stay on the third floor where they had a few bedrooms made up for them. And it grew and grew, and they started having to buy apartments for these boys and keep them under control, of course. And when things grew, like I just said, they pushed, and so it pushed up further, up to the Ingleside area also. And some boys at first would stay with the girls in the Mount St. Vincent Orphanage, but they developed their own building and their own culture. And where that happened was, instead of Mount St. Vincent Orphanage, which was very close to being behind the W School, and near the Holyoke, what was called back then a city farm, and later grew up to be a poor person's place. The Brightside Orphanage for Boys was about half mile further south, right very close to the West Springfield border of Holyoke. And there they had their own home, and the nuns developed a convent for themselves called Our Lady of the Victory Convent, and they were very close to each other. And then also what developed was another building, because they found that, sure, you can have a boys' orphanage and a girls' orphanage, but you also want to have a little children's orphanage. And so that developed too. And in the beginning, that was anyone that was less than 2 years old could be inside that building. So they had 3 orphanages going at the same time. And it grew and grew. And it turned out that by the end, that what was called the Bethlehem Orphanage, or the one for little children, had at maximum up to like 150 little children. And that's because Holyoke was growing bigger. A lot of people were dying young, and there were so many baby orphans. Or if there were two parents and one of the parents died, the other parent couldn't provide for their children, and when they were very young, under 2 years old, they would go to the Bethlehem orphanage, right? And so also you had these three things going. You had the convent, you had this church develop, and what else you need? Well, you need activities, and they had their own school going. So there was a Brightside school for these boys, and that school grew larger and larger, and it turned out to be that they made it very close to where the boys resided in the orphanage. And the boys also needed tasks to keep themselves busy, to learn, and what they did was they had their own farm. So there was a Brightside farm for these boys. There was a barn, so they'd learn how to milk the cows, for instance. So they did a lot of things here. And it's incredible. People will say, oh, life was not good at Brightside. But actually, if you do a very careful study and you keep in mind what scientists do, have a control group, say to yourself that you compare the Brightside environment to an environment in the tenement houses of Holyoke and say, oh, is this 10-year-old boy being brought up better, the same, or worse than a person in, say, South Holyoke or the flat section of Holyoke? Well, if you look at everything, the school, the church environment, the tasks they had to do on the farm, how much heat they had, what quality of care they had, they might have actually had it better at Brightside. Sure, they had to work hard, but so did the 10-year-old boy downtown. And you compare it to how much heat did they have. Well, they probably had just more than the person downtown. How much food did they have? They probably had better food at the orphanage than a typical 10-year-old boy in 1900 had downtown. So to say that it was a bad place, no way. Because people are not comparing it to what the average boy or girl in Holyoke had at that time. They're trying to force their 21st century mentality onto the situation. And so one has to be very careful when you're looking at whether one thing is better or worse.
Now, before we continue with our interview, listeners, you can check out his website for more information on the services that he provides at holyokecanaltour.org. There he has videos, other podcasts, past and present photos, and his current schedule. And he also has private tours, for some of which are of the local canals, reservoirs, cemeteries, as well as churches, and various parks and streets in Holyoke, South Hadley, and Chicopee, Mass. You can also set up private tours with him as your personal tour guide. They make for great group parties for special occasions and events, as well as also for educational and fun activities for the entire family, or for just a day out. So you can email him directly about that at bobcat4214 at capital B at yahoo.com. Again, that's BOBCAT 4214 capital B at yahoo.com. So going back to our interview, what did the Sisters of Providence do for Holyoke?
Well, when they came in 1873, at first they were nurses, and they started out the Providence Hospital in that year. It was located in South Hadley for the first, I believe, 4 years they stayed there. But by the next year, 1874, they started up another Providence Hospital, so there were two going. And that one they started in downtown Holyoke, on the block to the south of St. Jerome's Church. And so you had two places going. And they also took over the education of the boys at the St. Jerome's Institute, which was the elementary Catholic school of St. Jerome's. And that faced right on to Hampden Street. They weren't naturally teachers by design, so they didn't like doing that. But Father Harkins wanted them to do that, so they did it. Now, another thing they also did were they were social workers, and they wanted, in this most Catholic of cities and towns, they wanted to start up orphanage, and they did that for the girls, then they did that for the boys, and those were called Mount St. Vincent Orphanage and Brightside Orphanage. And they also want to take care of the elderly people. And the elderly were taken care of at a couple locations. Also, the men at first went to the Mount St. Vincent Orphanage and lived with the girls. But the women started downtown, and that was called the Father Harkins Elderly Home for Old Women. And there they could live for free and do light tasks. They also started up that Fountain Hospital, our orphanage for little babies. And all this they did without much taking care of themselves. So they would share convents with the groups that they started up, so they'd stay right in the orphanage, for instance. By 1932, though, they started finally their own mother house, and that's a gorgeous mother house that's in the very back side of the Ingleside neighborhood. So they've done a lot for Holyoke, and they're still active in Holyoke and also in other communities like Springfield and Greenfield and Worcester and Pittsfield. But along the way, they became their own order. So instead of being called the Sisters of Providence, based in Kingston, Ontario, they wanted to become a new order, and they applied to the Bishop of Springfield for the right to become a new order of nuns, and he applied to the Vatican and asked the Pope, can they become an order of nuns? And he said yes, and they became the Sisters of Providence based in Holyoke, a new group. And so thus, among the first that Holyoke has, they have one of the 2,000 orders of nuns ever made in the world. So they've done a lot for Holyoke, and I'm glad they're celebrating their 150th anniversary this year.
So now what did the Sisters at St. Joseph do for Holyoke?
Okay, they are also based out in the Ingleside area, in the Brightside area. But out there they have, it's not really the mother house, it's their summer house. And it used to also be the novitiate, where the rookie nuns would stay. And what do? The Sisters of St. Joseph were the teachers. And they taught in many schools, mostly schools based upon the Irish ethnicity. So they taught in Blessed Sacrament, in the Holy Rosary Church, in the St. Jerome's Church after the Sister Providence left from teaching. And they taught in Chicopee, they taught in Springfield, they taught in many other locations around the area. They started up Elms College. So they are a great group also. And both orders have big places out in Ingleside. And they both have their cemeteries, individual cemeteries out there.
So thank you, Robert, for joining us. And again, you can find out more information on his tours at his website, holyokecanaltour.org. There you can find his various tours, podcasts, and videos and photos. You can also check out his 2023 schedule for the rest of the year and keep an eye out for his 2024 schedule as it becomes available. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for tuning into our podcast. We are coming to you from South Hadley, Massachusetts. I am your host, Carrie, and joining me is Holyoke's very own local historian and creator of the Historical Tours of Greater Holyoke, Robert Comun. He offers both public and private tours, as well as presentations of the local canal systems, reservoirs, cemeteries, and churches, as well as various parks and streets in Holyoke, South Hadley, and Chicopee, Massachusetts. Now you actually lead these tours and give these presentations yourself, is that correct?
Yes, and this Ingleside may have a low population, but it's a lot of history.
Okay, and yeah, you're going to be telling us about the Ingleside neighborhood, correct? So, now, what is Brightside?
Brightside is a sub-neighborhood within the Ingleside neighborhood. It's where the 3 orphanages were for the Catholic religion, and also, of course, the Providence Hospital was placed there. Of course, you need the convents if you have that, and when you build up things like this, you get other things. They ended up getting an old age home for men, and it was a neighborhood that was affectionately known as Brightside. It started really as a girls' orphanage, in the upper part of Brightside towards the north. And then the boys started, and then they kept developing. They got an infant orphanage for 2-year-olds and less, and the name itself is not the true name. So the true name was very different. It was the girls were called the Holy Name One, for instance. But a lot of people like to call it Brightside because there was a farm out there, and the farm was started by Warren Wilkinson. He owned the Springfield Blanket Company, which was a company that made blankets for horses. And he loved to make gentleman's farm for himself. And he made it out in Brightside. And his farm and his barn had the name Brightside because the terrain was such that in the east, where the sun was rising, was also the Connecticut River, and it would be very bright in the morning because of beautiful sunrise. And people took on that name, and they started calling all the orphanages as a group Brightside. And it's still called that, even though Brightside has moved out to Springfield. The whole area is still called that. There's also a couple of cemeteries, and there also used to be the farm continued to go on because the boys needed chores to do, and they would do that morning and then at night in between they would do school. So it was quite an arrangement.
So now, how does the river affect this neighborhood?
All right, so this is one of the neighborhoods of Holyoke that's right on the Connecticut River, and down as you go towards the river, there's for instance, one place that's called the Land of Providence. That's where the Sisters of Providence owned property, and they kept that property for over a century, and they finally, in recent years, gave it away to Trustees of Reservation, which is a private land trust group in Massachusetts, and they take care of the land now. Also down along the Connecticut River is Holyoke Rows, ROWS, and there is a place that you can have rowing competitions, or you can go on the river with non-motorized boats. There's also La Finca, which is a farm, which is actually several farmers rented out, and part of the Land of Providence is also rented out too. So as you go towards the river, you almost have another sub-neighborhood, and people like to call that part of Brightside.
So quickly before we continue with the rest of the interview, just to fill our listeners in, if you want to find out more information or sign up for any of his various tours, you can check out his website at holyokecanaltour.org. There he has both videos of the various stops along each tour, also past and present photos of the historical sites throughout as well. And if you are interested in setting up a private tour, you can email him directly at bobcat4214, capital B, at yahoo.com. And they are perfect for fun and educational outdoor activities for the whole family or for group parties, especially those special occasions and get-togethers. And they're also good just for getting outdoors for the day. So getting back to our interview, how has this neighborhood changed in the last half century?
Yes, well, times definitely changed. And this neighborhood, for instance, in the 60s and 70s moved to a point still touching Brightside, but to a point that was actually in West Springfield. And then they just moved away totally. Then residential units came in. They filled in the Brightside area at many points, included into the mother house of the Sisters of Providence and into the former Brightside neighborhood, and they added a few units there, so it became bigger. And of course, the Sisters of Providence are still around, but most of them are gone, and they gave out their Land of Providence. They've also got more of the city of Holyoke now owns a place for the older people on what used to be the city farm. And most importantly of all, in 1979, enormous change where the Holyoke Mall came onto some of the land the Sisters of Providence owned. The Sisters got a lot of money from that deal, but it also changed the neighborhood enormously for Ingleside. Now, there's parts of Ingleside, not Brightside, that are towards the north. In that part, for instance, had the school. They had a lot of residential homes on the side streets of Main Street and Route 5. So there are parts that are not connected. And so it was definitely a neighborhood within Holyoke, but it probably had the lowest or next to the lowest population of the 15 neighborhoods of Holyoke.
So now tell us about the Ingleside School.
All right, so the former school is gone. So almost every neighborhood in Holyoke had to have a school, of course. And this school was faced onto Main Street, and it was right where La Finca entrance is. And you can still go into the park. It's called the Ingleside Park, and this was the playground for the students. You can still see where the school probably was in this little park. And it's a cool little park. It's been replaced by a playground. The back of it comes very close to Route 5, and it's a cozy little place. Now, this whole area is pretty much open space. We have lots of green space, including, of course, the finca and the river and almost all of the land of Providence and the place behind the Providence Hospital. But this little cozy park is still a cool little place, and it might have had the lowest amount of students going of any school in Holyoke. So I think on my webpage I have a beautiful picture. Thank you.
So thank you, Robert, for educating us on your tours, and we want to thank our listeners for tuning in. And you can also tune into a large selection of other podcasts and much more at his website, holyokecanaltour.org again. And again, you can email him directly for private tours or to inquire about anything else at bobcat4214, capital B, at yahoo.com. And be sure to keep an eye out for all of his upcoming 2024 season tours and more as they become available.